Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the public forum today. Our forum this afternoon has been sponsored by the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, or CREW. CREW is a coalition of private and public representatives working together to improve the ability of communities throughout the Cascadia region to reduce the effects of earthquakes and related hazards such as tsunami. Our goals are to promote efforts to reduce the loss of life and property damage from earthquakes, to educate and motivate decision makers, managers, and the general public to reduce risks associated with earthquakes, and foster productive linkages between scientists, critical infrastructure providers, businesses, and governmental agencies in order to improve the resilience of communities after an earthquake. This is a busy week for CREW. We just finished our board meetings this morning, and we had committee meetings yesterday afternoon. CREW has a full slate of activities for the coming year and plans for even more activities next year as we will begin our 2012 funding year in August of this year. You may have noticed at the back we have a handout with more information about the organization. There's plenty of opportunities for people to get involved. We have a very diverse membership, and we value the contributions of all of our current members, and there's plenty of opportunities for you to get involved, and I encourage you to do so. Okay, for those of you attending remotely, welcome to the webinar. And since this is a little different format than our previous WebEx type events, in order to ask questions of the panelists, please email Heidi Candathil at hkandathil@crew.org. It may be difficult to see online, but her email address is on the screen next to me. When you send in an email, please include which panelist the question is for, along with your question, and we will make sure to relay those to our panelists. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Chris Goldfinger. He is a marine geologist and geophysicist with a focus on great earthquakes and structure of subduction zones around the world. He has experience with deep submersibles, multi-beam side scan sonar, seismic reflection, and other marine geophysical tools on over 35 oceanographic cruises over the last 20 years. He is currently working on great subduction earthquakes along the Cascadia, northeast Japan, and Sumatran margins, as well as the northern San Andreas Fault off northern California, using the evidence for earthquakes found in deep sea sediments. Dr. Goldfinger is a professor of marine geology and received his PhD in structural geology from Oregon State University in 1994. Our second speaker will be Kent Yu, PhD, PESE. Kent is principal and branch manager for Degenkolb Engineers in Portland, Oregon. He joined Degenkolb in 1999, right after receiving his PhD in structural engineering from the University of California at San Diego. He has worked on projects of all construction types that include seismic evaluation and retrofit design of existing buildings, structural design of new construction, condition assessment, historic preservation, and post-earthquake inspections. He conducted numerous earthquake reconnaissance trips, including the 2008 China earthquake, the 2010 Chilean earthquake, and the 2011 Tohoku, Japan earthquake. He is a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers Technical Committee for Lifeline Earthquake Engineering, if I got the acronym correct, and ASCE 7 Tsunami Loads and Effects. He is the current chairman of the Oregon Seismic Safety Policy Advisory Commission and will be leading a statewide resilience planning effort to help mitigate seismic tsunami risk in Oregon. That event begins tomorrow, so also a very busy week for Kent. And our final speaker will be Dr. Althea Rizzo. She is the Geologic Hazards Program Coordinator at the Oregon Office of Emergency Management. She is currently working to enhance public education and outreach, preparedness, mitigation, and recovery efforts in order to create a safer Oregon for residents, businesses, and visitors. She is active on regional and national earthquake and tsunami advisory commissions and policy advisory groups. She received her PhD in design and human environment with a minor in anthropology from Oregon State University in 2010. For the format today, we'll have our three presenters, and then there will be a panel discussion afterwards. Please hold your questions until that time. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. Okay, our first presenter will be Dr. Goldfinger.
Are we going to be able to dim the lights a little bit? Yeah, I know. Okay. Well, thank you for the nice introduction. And so today's topic really for all three of us is lessons learned from Tohoku. And we could easily go on for a full day about that, and we're going to try to pack this into 2 hours, and it's going to be difficult, actually. Oh, sorry. Does this work? Get a little closer. Is that better? Yeah, that might be better. So, lessons from Tohoku is a long topic, and you might not think it would be that long because we just recently had a magnitude 9 earthquake in Sumatra, and wouldn't we have learned pretty much everything we could learn from that. Turns out not to be true, though. Many of the lessons from Sumatra really apply to a very different environment, very different built environment, very different society, completely different in almost every way. And some of the lessons learned there really don't apply as well to Cascadia as Japan does. Japanese society is much more technically oriented, and the built environment is quite a bit different. So, so it's really a very different set of lessons altogether. So I'm going to talk about mostly geologic and maybe seismologic lessons, and drift a little bit into some observations about the society, and not too much though, because Althea will talk about that as well. But one of the really obvious first lessons, and I'll kind of just tick these off as we go along, is that the Japanese, as we all know, are were very well prepared for an earthquake. They had infrastructure that was really designed for earthquakes that was second to none in the world. They had systems that would shut down trains, shut down power plants, things like that. They were very, very well prepared. And so it's a little bit surprising that they were caught so badly as they were in Tohoku. And the reason was fundamentally that they prepared very well for an earthquake, but they prepared for the wrong earthquake. And so it's critical to get the geologic and geophysical story right, so you know what you're preparing for. And so they expected and planned for what the historical records and seismological theories predicted would be the maximum considered earthquake, and that was about an 8.4. And they had about 1,000 years of history, which really didn't contain much more than an 8.4. And a well-known geophysical theory, or seismological theory, I should say, Ruffin-Canamore in 1980, is one that really sort of set the stage for how people saw the world's subduction zones. And I'll show you the model in a second, but that model related plate age and convergence rate to the maximum size of the earthquake. And it was wrong, unfortunately. But it was held in high regard and used commonly throughout the geological sciences for the last several decades. And it made a prediction about both Sumatra and northeast Japan that were incorrect. So here's the model, just a plot of plate age, subducting plate age versus rate of subduction here. And these regression lines are earthquake magnitudes, 7, 7.5, 8, 9, and 9.5. And you can see southern Chile is up here at 9.5. That's the biggest earthquake ever. And northeast Japan, according to this plot, plotted exactly where the historical records predicted, or agreed with the historical records, at about 8.2 to 8.4. So it was sort of a perfect storm of a seismological prediction and 1,000 years of history that agreed well and caused the Japanese to choose 8.4 as their maximum considered magnitude. It just turns out that this doesn't work. And in 1980, that wasn't known, but now it's quite obvious that it does not work. So prepare for the, geologic lesson number 2 here is basically that you can't capture the behavior of a fault with only 100 to 200 years of seismological data. You just can't do it. It turns out that in the history of Tohoku, there was one earthquake in that 1,000-year history that was probably as big as 2011. It was in the year 869. It was just at the dim reaches of history. But it was recorded, it happened, and it was forgotten, frankly. And so what was remembered was the more recent events, the 8.0s, 8.2s, things like that. So a model like this is strictly based on seismology and even historical records. And you just cannot make a prediction about what a fault can do when it may have repeat times of earthquakes in hundreds or even thousands of years. So it was a fundamental mistake in the early days of plate tectonics that was never corrected. So there weren't many places where you could go and see evidence of surface rupture of this fault because it's a subduction zone. It's fundamentally subsurface and underwater. But there was one fault that ruptured the surface in Japan, and it was this one. And this is an extensional fault in the upper plate. And what that means is the upper plate essentially jumped so far to the west, the spring unloaded so completely that it actually pulled apart the upper plate as it extended. So it actually overshot the amount of energy that it had stored. And I won't go into too much depth about this, but what that means is that the locked plate, here's the subducting plate beneath Japan, this represents Japan, here's the trench out here in the ocean. It was coupled, oddly, down to great depths that were not expected. It was coupled down almost to the Japanese volcanic arc, which would be equivalent to being having a locked plate all the way to the Cascades. Fortunately, only this part ruptured during the earthquake. This part, which is inexplicably coupled in places that it should be too hot to do that, did not rupture during the earthquake, but right now as we speak, being relieved in a very slow earthquake that's taking months and months to accomplish. But anyway, that fault that I just showed is right here in the upper plate, and it shows extension, like these arrows here, which indicates that the upper plate relieved itself completely. So this was a really big earthquake that relieved every bit of strain or every bit of stress that was available, and a little bit more. It actually overshot. So geologic lesson number 3 is plates can be coupled to much greater depths than we used to think. This has not been explained. It had been observed in GPS data, and because it didn't fit current models, people sort of put blinders on and really didn't want to talk about it much. But this deep coupling has not yet been well explained. In Cascadia, we also observed some deep coupling, and it spawned an abstract that I wrote a long time ago, and a recent paper by Chapman and Melbourne that talk about deep coupling in Cascadia, and how the locked plate interface might actually go as far as the east side of the Coast Range, or the east side of the Olympics. And that's raised some alarm about the subduction zone actually rupturing that deep. But it turns out that actually violates a lot of other data. And so the lesson from Tohoku is that you can have deep coupling, but it doesn't mean that that's going to rupture in an earthquake. You can release this stress in a slow earthquake, and that's what's occurring today in Japan. And so the lesson here may be that these sort of alarmist papers that were written, and I wrote one of them, were probably wrong, and that stress will be relieved in a different way. So here's what the tsunami zone looks like to a geologist. Here's one row of trees back from the beach, it's still underwater. This isn't because the water didn't drain away, it's because the land level dropped about a meter, and so this is permanently flooded at high tide now. Here's some sand boils and the tsunami deposit itself sitting at the surface. But if you dig a hole there, what you find is, and I don't know if you can see this well, but just below the surface is another tsunami deposit, and a very thick one. And it's actually thicker than the one that's at the surface in Sendai right now, and in Ishinomaki, where this pit is. And so this tsunami deposit was from the 869 Jogan tsunami, and we went there to do some field reconnaissance of this and compare it to the modern one. And others have done this as well. And so this is just a plot of present-day ground surface and some cores that were taken. And that 869 tsunami is, I'm having trouble seeing where it is on this plot, is this one. And it extends pretty far landward, actually further landward than the 2011 tsunami deposit. And there's several others here that you can see. This is the ocean side here that didn't extend very far inland, and these were the smaller earthquakes that have happened in the last 1,000 years. And here's some correlation diagrams of those cores. And this particular earthquake is very well known. It's dated very carefully, and it's associated with an ash layer from a volcano that went off about that time. So it's very easy to find it in the Ishinomaki plain and identify it, even in the casual way that we did. And so here's a paper by Shishikura that you may have heard of in 2007, who mapped, this is the extent of the Jogan tsunami sand from 869. It extends 5 kilometers inland, and these red dots here are the pits that we dug that we wanted to see if we could verify this result. And we did. It's there right as Shishikura-san had mapped it. Here's what it looks like in Google Earth. And here's the, so here are those same pits, and we found the Jogan tsunami going all the way back to the base of the coastal hills. And it actually extended all the way back and must have hit the coastal hills because it was still going right as we dug a pit in a fellow's backyard right up against the hills. This is the extent of the 2011 tsunami deposit, and this is the extent of the tsunami inundation at this site. So even though the coastline has changed by about 1 kilometer, since Jogan times, it looks like this tsunami was quite a bit bigger than actually the 2011 tsunami. So there was evidence at that time that, in 2007, 2008, that the historical earthquakes were too small, that actually this subduction zone could produce something much larger. And here's another tsunami deposit we found. This is just digging a hole about 1 kilometer from the Hitachi Daini nuclear plant, the one that didn't melt down, that you probably haven't heard of. They were able to get a cold shutdown on that plant before the tsunami arrived. And here's another tsunami deposit just about 1 kilometer inland from that plant. So the evidence is there of great earthquakes in the past. And the first evidence really was found by Minora-san, who found the Jogan tsunami in 2001. And another colleague named Yasutaki Keita actually made a prediction that the northeast Japan subduction zone would have a magnitude 9 earthquake. He made this in 2005. He didn't specify a date or a time. It was just a forecast, of course. And his evidence was mostly these tide gauges. So these are 8 tide gauges along the Tohoku coast, numbered here. And what they show is that sea level was rising relative to the land, or the land was sinking relative to sea level. And that's what these curves show, is relative sea level rise over the last few decades. The only one that didn't show that was one here that was next to a coal mine that was probably messed up by human activities. But anyway, along this coast, and you can see it in these, and this is the contoured data, these blue contours, show that the sea level was coming up at a breathtaking rate of 5 to 10 millimeters a year. That's a huge, huge rate geologically. And what it says is that the entire coast of northeast Japan was being dragged down by the coupling of the downgoing plate at a rate that's several times higher than what it is in Cascadia or what it was in Sumatra. And what that means is that there's a very large coupled area offshore, and most of that released during the 2011 earthquake, and that's this pink blob. The little blobs here are the historical earthquakes. And what Ikeda-san reasoned was that these historical earthquakes were far too small to account for this gigantic sea level change in sea level, and that because this rate was so big and was so unaffected by the historical earthquakes. Here you can see these little notches in the data represent smaller historical earthquakes, 7.7 and 8.4. But after these events, Northeast Japan kept going down like crazy. The little events, the little earthquakes had no impact. So he predicted that this entire area must eventually go off in a giant earthquake to reverse these huge rates, and he was correct. And that was in 2005. So the knowledge that Tohoku could do this actually existed, just as in Katrina the engineers predicted a Cat 5 hurricane would take out the levees, and it did, as predicted. So geologic lesson number 4 is that the maximum considered earthquake and other things about earthquakes, like the frequencies, the segment boundaries, stress triggering of other faults, and things like that, can't be determined without long earthquake records. Seismologic proxies have not been successful at predicting what earthquake we should plan for. They just don't work. So we need long records or some very good geophysical data like this and some clear thinking about what it means to really get at the maximum earthquake size. Whoops. So another controversial thing, global clustering. So everybody is wondering, or many people have been wondering, what about global clustering? We've had Sumatra, Chile, and now Tohoku. What about global clustering? And there it is. So you can see that great earthquakes clustered between around 1950 and 1964. Then there were no magnitude 9 earthquakes until 2004 Sumatra, and then another cluster of large earthquakes, and maybe a less well-known cluster back here in 1920. So three items are not enough to really build a story with, and so statistically you can't really say anything about this. It could well be random. And a lot of seismologists, Peter Shearer and Andy Michael in particular, have recently written that that global clustering does not exist. They simply look at the seismological record, which remember is only 100 years long, and say global clustering can't exist because we can't prove that it does. And so they take smaller earthquakes, and since we obviously don't have enough 9s to do the statistics, they take smaller earthquakes and perform the tests on those, and the smaller earthquakes show no clustering at those time intervals. The problem is that magnitude 9 earthquakes are not required to behave the same as smaller earthquakes. They may be quite different. And the evidence of that, the model of Shearer and Michael are basically based on something called the Gutenberg-Richter law, which says if you have a magnitude 9 earthquake, you should have 10 magnitude 8s and 100 magnitude 7s and 1,000 magnitude 6s. That's the Gutenberg-Richter law. And the problem is it doesn't work. How many people have felt a magnitude 7 earthquake in Cascadia lately? Nobody. So Gutenberg-Richter fails in Cascadia, and it fails in many other subduction zones because it's not behaving that way. So you can't use smaller earthquakes to predict the behavior of big ones. And so they failed to prove that clustering doesn't exist. And again, once again, seismology is just simply too short of a record to get at it. So geologic lesson number 5 is seismology cannot address the issue of global clustering at all. Clusters could be random, or they may not be random. And if they are not random, then it's possible that this may add an element of risk in the near term for Cascadia. So a few words about resiliency. It turns out on March 11th, I was at an earthquake meeting in Kashiwa, just north of Tokyo, and we were talking about the Sumatran earthquake. So a room full of seismologists and earthquake geologists, all in the middle of somebody's talk about Sumatra when this happened at 2:45 on Friday afternoon. And it was actually the third earthquake of the week. We'd had two before that. We had a 7.44 shock on Wednesday afternoon. We all evacuated. So when this happened, our first reaction was, oh no, not another earthquake. We were looking forward to finishing the meeting, going out to dinner and having a good time, and it's like this was going to slow the meeting down if we had to evacuate. What can I say? So everybody, besides that, everybody immediately looked at their watches. And first we kind of stood there. But then we looked at our watches. I think we all looked around a little bit and realized that we weren't in any particular danger where we were. But this earthquake went on for a very long time. And I'll just show you what it actually looked like, because we had a film going of the meeting. So here we are. We're changing speakers and about to start a talk on Sumatra. And so this little camera was on a tripod, just filming the whole session. And right about now, the main shock has already happened. It's winging its way to our location, and the P wave will arrive here in just a second or two. Okay, there's the P wave. Pretty dramatic, huh? Everybody's going, what was that? They're looking at his watch. What time is it? We're laughing. It's an earthquake. They have earthquakes in Japan all the time. But where's the earthquake? You can't see anything happening. Everybody's just standing there, sort of holding on to these are our Indonesian colleagues. You can't really see. Oh, now you can see the screen shaking a little bit. Well, it turns out that this camera has a stabilizer in it. Completely took the earthquake out. But you can see the projector wiggling a little bit. So this is what a magnitude 9 earthquake looks like at about the same range Portland is from the Cascadia lock zone. Now they pan the camera over and you can see the blinds are kind of flapping against the window a little bit. And then we thought, maybe we should go outside. I showed this to the emergency managers and they went, no, don't do that. You should get under the desk. Well, you can see the desks are flimsy little plastic things on rollers. So there's no way we're going to get under those. Now it's getting a little more dramatic. The S waves are arriving. And now we're kind of scurrying a little more. But the thing is, we were in a brand new base-isolated, bomb-proof building, and we knew it. So there was really no reason for a whole lot of panic. And we were only on the second floor of a 2-story building, so it's a very short, squat structure. But I'm just showing you this so you can get an idea of what a magnitude 9 earthquake looks at about that range for people in the Willamette Valley, Puget, Willamette Lowland. Now you might notice as pan past some of the concrete beams in this building, they're about 1 meter square. They're massive, and the building is base isolated. So this is a very, very, very tough building. So the main shock lasted about 5 minutes for us, and 5 minutes is just an eternity. It's an incredibly long time. So we went outside and sort of took it all in, watched the whole thing. And once you got outside, you could see a little bit more drama. You could actually see the building going back and forth, digging a little hole in the garden. And there was a flagpole on the 7th floor of the building next door, a big, stout, aluminum tapered flagpole, and it was whipping through about 40 degrees of vertical. So it was quite impressive. And all the trees were shaking, and they had dry, rattly leaves from the fall that were still on there and making sort of an eerie noise. But you can see that a magnitude 9 earthquake does not knock people off their feet. You can walk around, you can do things, you can make decisions about how to react to it. And people are just sort of strolling outside, still looking at their watches. We're now about maybe the 2nd or 3rd minute into this. And it's really kind of hard to tell anything is going on. But remember, we're in Japan with very, very strong buildings. Nothing's collapsing. There's nothing to fall on people's head. There's no overhanging parapets. There are no unreinforced masonry buildings. All the old building stock has long since been removed. And so this just becomes an exciting day for people at this range from a subduction zone earthquake. And so we were out there so long, just kind of, at this point in time, we're now into the, oops, let's get rid of this one. We're now into the 4th minute of the earthquake. I think this thing comes in 2 chunks. And the main shock is still going on. And we said, well, let's take a picture. We were going to come out here and do a group picture anyway. Let's just do it now. Kind of a silly idea, but the undercurrent here was that in Japan, a magnitude 9 earthquake was not expected. An earthquake that lasted 5 minutes was not expected at all. And by the time we got to minute 5, first of all, we knew that Ruffin Kanamori was out the window. This is a bunch of people who study earthquakes. And we knew that it was a magnitude 9. We knew it was close by. We knew that somebody was about to get hammered with a giant tsunami. Those things all follow from just the length of time of the earthquake. And everybody knew that. This just shouldn't have been happening. So that's what it looks like. So resiliency lesson number 1, subduction zone earthquakes don't necessarily shake that hard, but they're very, very, very long. So your structures have to be built for that kind of duration and very low frequency. So when you go around Sendai, and I went back in June to look around and do some recon of the tsunami deposits. And when you go there, what you see is this. You don't see a lot of earthquake damage, and we looked hard to find some. We didn't find a lot, but typically if you look out over Sendai, you see this. About 10% of the buildings have blue tarps where some tiles had slid off, and I guess the Tiles R Us store ran out, and so they threw blue tarps over the empty patches. So there was not a lot of damage, and these are mostly very, very much Western style construction in these houses. Two-story wood frame buildings, much like ours, although they were all bolted for the most part. The tsunami again was another story, though. This is a small river leading up a canyon where you can see the tsunami has stripped all the vegetation off. This is about at a height of about 150 feet off the water. So the tsunami was funneled up this canyon and took all the fishing boats with it to that height. So resilience means different things in different cultures, and the Japanese are quite take a quite different view of things. This is at the little fishing port right near that site, and all the boats were destroyed. The people survived. There were no casualties here. And the people were going around and collecting up everything that might be used in the future. So this is a set of throttle and gear shift cables for an outboard motor. And people picked up stuff like this and decided whether it was still usable or not and coiled it neatly and just put it down. And little piles of dock lines and fenders and outboard oil and things that could be used in the future. And they were building, they were being resilient from the ground up, just one little bit at a time. This is just a hat found in the tsunami zone. It says, "Bring it on," if you can't read that. And so shops around town were sort of focal points for positive messages on the walls. I think people who've been there have seen all of these in all the local stores. And they were also focal points for volunteerism, to meet up and leave messages and do cleanup and things like that. There was no looting to speak of, except for a few foreigners, one shopkeeper told us. So it's a very cohesive society, I guess, is the message. Here's what it looks like in a more built-up coastal town, where there's very little earthquake damage, but the town at high tide is now underwater. And here's a nice garden that was wrecked by salt intrusion. But again, no real earthquake damage, except for the liquefaction, where the power poles and phone line poles, utility poles, were leaning because the soils had liquefied. But some people still live there. Here's kids going off to school, and all the rubber boots sold very well. And so even at high tide, you can still get around. It's only a few inches deep. And some businesses were open. If you had boots, you could still get a haircut. And this lady was headed off to the store. But here's what else happened. The liquefaction caused subsidence of the streets, and the vertical parts of the sewer stayed where they were, and so they now are sticking out of the street about 30 centimeters. There was landslide damage, and this is sort of what we can probably expect on most of the coast highways, and some of these were closed by this sort of thing. The roads themselves were damaged quite a bit. They were quite rough in most places. And here's that same fault I mentioned. Unfortunately, this fault, a little to the left, went through a very nice house and just ripped it in half. But this is one of the rare cases where the earthquake actually directly damaged structures. Here was a road where there was a meter-high scarp from that same fault that had to be repaired. But fairly light damage, again, from the earthquake itself. It was really about the tsunami. And so, but communities, some fared better than others, and you've probably all seen this stone that was in the New York Times. It says, among other things, if you build your house above this sign, you'll live a long and happy life. And people in this community were a small beach launch fishing community, and they heeded the sign, and they built above that, and they were fine. They lost their boats, but that was it. And so just to the left here, about 200 feet up the hill, people were just working in their gardens. There was nothing going on. They had no damage, nothing to do, nothing to recover from. To the right, about 200 feet downhill, was the high water mark of the tsunami. And then, of course, they'd lost their boats. They were trying to figure out how to replace those. But this community did very well because they didn't ignore the past. And so here's to the right of that picture. Here's a trashed outboard motor and that same canyon that leads down to the beach. 150 feet off the water, stripped all the vegetation. And here it's hard, there's nothing in here for scale except this utility pole, but this is the breakwater that protected the beach at that town. This block here is about the size of a house. And these were stacked up building the breakwater, and they were scattered all around. There were only two of these blocks were even visible anywhere in sight. And I have no idea how much a 30 by 30 by 30 cube of concrete weighs, but it's a lot. Some resiliency was achieved by massive infusions of money, and so this is another solution for a small fishing community where the houses and the boats are stored behind this massive wall, and there's a gigantic steel door that closes this off. And when the earthquake warning goes off, this door rolls shut and keeps the water out. And it worked. This town didn't lose even their boats. And this massive wall and massive door only protects about half a dozen houses and boats. Very small town. So, resiliency lesson number 4, if resources are committed, many preparedness issues can be solved. And so in Cascadia, now Cascadia is a completely different situation. We've been only studying the geology of Cascadia in this respect with earthquakes for really about 20 years or so. And through Brian Atwater and a group of others, we've learned quite a bit about past earthquakes by mucking through the mud. And so this is paleoseismology. So we've learned about past earthquakes without a historical record at all. And it's worked quite well. So in many respects, we know quite a bit about Cascadia earthquakes. And here's the work I do. I work offshore and collect core samples to look at earthquake-generated deposits. And I won't dwell too much on the science of it, but just by correlating these sand deposits in cores and radiocarbon dating them, we can link each site to other sites and build up a story about the rupture length of past earthquakes, the relative sizes of past earthquakes, and things like that. And so I'll just summarize it. It looks like this. We now have a 10,000-year record of earthquakes in Cascadia, which is, I think, the longest for any. It's definitely the longest for any subduction zone in the world. And we have 41 events, and 19 of them tend to be like this. They tend to rupture most of the subduction zone, if not all of it. So these are the nines, the very large ones. We have a couple that rupture up to about the latitude of Astoria. We have about 10 that rupture up to the latitude of Newport, and about 10 more that rupture. Oops, this is a slightly old slide. We have about 10 more that rupture up to about the latitude of Coos Bay or so. So 41 in all, but they're not all the same. They come in sizes, and so these segmented ruptures seem to be limited to the southern part of the subduction zone. And so that has implications for probabilities, which are shown here. I won't try to explain this in the time that we have, but the bottom line is there are many more earthquakes in the southern part of the subduction zone, 41 in 10,000 years versus only 19 in the northern part. So probabilities are very, very different. So the repeat time in the south is about 240 years, the average repeat time, where in the north part it's about 500 years. Currently the USGS uses the 500-year number, and they're thinking about whether to revise the number for the southern part. So what that does to probabilities is that for the north, it's still about the same as it's been, 10 to 15% probability of an event in the next 50 years. But in the south, it bumps the probability up because we have so many more events and basically half the repeat time to about 35 to 37% chance in 50 years. And so statistically, that's enough to get your attention. 37% chance in 50 years is a very high probability. And so what it means is that in the last 10,000 years, we've had 41 earthquakes, and now today, 312 years after the last one, and say 50 years from now, 360 years, we will have exceeded the repeat times of all but 7 of those earthquakes. So, and that's 85%. So we'll have used up 85% of our time, if in actuarial terms, by 50 years from now. So I would say it's very, very likely that we'll have one of these, and the next one may well be limited to the southern margin. We've also had 2 giant earthquakes. We call them T11 and T16. They occurred at about 6,000 years ago and about 8,900 years ago. They're much bigger than all the rest, much like Tohoku and several other faults that we have long records for. It turns out that this behavior may be relatively common, to go very long periods of time with a set of average earthquakes and then have a giant, just like Tohoku went 1,000 years before it had a giant. And in this case, we've gone 6,000 years now since the last giant, and we've had 2 of them in 10,000 years, so an average repeat time of 5,000, and it's been 6,000 since the last one. So the 1700 earthquake, a magnitude 9, was actually not the maximum size earthquake. One of these was, and the magnitudes of these are about 9.1. Well, 9 or 9.1, that doesn't sound like much, but a 9.1 is 3.2 times the power of a 9. So it makes a big, big difference. And then because we have such a long record, we can actually look at cycling of the subduction zone in terms of how big were these earthquakes in the past. And what these upticks represent is energy gained of the subduction zone, and the downticks represent energy lost during the earthquake. And so each big downtick represents an earthquake, and each uptick represents just the energy accumulated by plate motion between earthquakes. And so I think you can see that there's sort of cycles going on here, if this is right. And here are the 2 giants, T16 and T11, right here. And so once the subduction zone has a giant earthquake like Tohoku or like T16 here, it's at a very low energy state, and it takes a long time for it to ratchet upward, gaining energy from plate motion, while having a bunch of small earthquakes in the meantime, until it gets to a high energy state, and then it has perhaps another giant. But it can also climb to a high energy state and then ratchet itself back downward to a low energy state without a giant. So what this means is it's very difficult to predict much of anything about what a subduction zone is going to do next, because the variability is high. So the question mark out here at the present day is, I should have put a giant question mark on there, but presently, even with all this history and all this information, we just have no idea really what it's going to do next. And unfortunately, all the proxies that people have tried to get at predicting that have not worked. So we've had Tohoku, in a way, the lesson learned overall is a big setback to our ability to predict anything about subduction zones. So, conclusions: resiliency depends critically on getting the hazards framed correctly. You have to have the right earthquake or you're wasting your time. Tohoku has taught us how little we really know about giant earthquakes in most areas of the world. In Cascadia, luckily, the hazards are on the way to being well characterized, but we're not quite there yet. The cultural side of resiliency favors a culture like that of Japan, where safety and prevention are taken far more seriously than we do in the U.S. And I didn't really talk about this much, but if you I've lived in Japan and learned how to speak Japanese a little bit, and the Japanese are very, very safety oriented. It's pervasive throughout the culture, almost to the point of paranoia or hypochondria. It's seriously, very seriously taken. You see Japanese wearing masks all the time. It's not to protect others, it's to not get sick. And simple things you can observe all the time. If you drop a piece of chocolate candy, an American would pick it up and eat it and say, "Oh, 5-second rule." Japanese would never do that. It's a simple little thing, but they're pervasively safety oriented, and we are not. We are not very good at preventing things. We don't plan ahead very much. We just let it happen and then try to fix it with massive amounts of repair afterward. So we really have our work cut out for us here. And the Japanese have a 1,000-year head start on thinking about how to react and prepare for tsunamis. And lastly, for the geophysics and geologists, the failure of predictive seismological models such as Ruff and Kanamori means that using proxies like plate age and convergence rate and other things can no longer be considered key drivers of predicting the maximum considered earthquake. Well, that's really bad, because if you look around the world, many subduction zones around the world had been scratched off the list of places that can generate giant earthquakes. So Peru, northern Chile, New Zealand, Java are all places where people essentially felt relatively safe from these things. And now that's not the case anymore. One of the most populous cities in the world, Jakarta, sits on top of one of these subduction zones, where they had been told for many years by eminent seismologists they shouldn't worry too much about an earthquake of this type. And so it doesn't affect Cascadia so much because we already have gotten the bad news years ago. But some of these other places may well generate these, and nobody's really at all sure how we're going to answer the question whether all of them, some of them, or any of them are capable of magnitude 9 earthquakes. But we do have tools now. We have paleoseismology. We can just go find out what happened in the past, even absent proxies that can be used to predict. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goldfinger. As a reminder, I'd like to hold the questions until the end, and we'll have a panel discussion. Our next presenter will be Kent Yu.
While I'm getting ready for my talk, I want to share with you a little joke. Chris was talking about a 5-second rule. I had the same experience with my son. He dropped a piece of food on the floor. I mentioned to him the 5-second rule. He said, "Daddy, I think you're right. Here for you. You eat it." All right. Okay. Kids are very smart. So what I want to talk about is my experience I saw from Japan, mostly focused on the tsunami. And another engineer from Degenkolb, Jay Love, our senior principal in Oakland office, he's pretty active in research in ERI, and he focused on the building side of it. So the story I want to tell you today is mostly focused on his experience and my experience.
Excuse me, could you use the microphone?
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So quickly go over the outline. In the beginning, I'm going to talk about the information we collected from the news media. Then I will talk about the Tohoku University, which is a successful story. University over there is pretty resilient, even with a 9.0 magnitude earthquake. Then I'll talk about my observation related to the tsunami effects on buildings, oil tanks, and the port facilities. And towards the end, I'll share with you some of the lessons we learned from Japan, whether on the failure side or on the successful side. The Japan earthquake, essentially, Japan is sitting on the 4 plates, and the Pacific Ocean plate is moving to the west and dive underneath the North American plate. And so that's where the earthquake happened. So after earthquake, the Japan coastline dropped down by 3 feet, as Dr. Goldfinger mentioned also. And the country was rebound to the southeast direction for roughly about 15 feet also. One other thing is I want to share with you about the ground motion recorded. Chris mentioned that subduction on earthquake can be very, very long. And so there are some of the recordings. In some cases, you look at the ground motion, you felt, gee, well, what is this? It almost looks like 2 earthquakes back to back. This is kind of I saw the similar earthquake records actually in Chile and or in Peru. And seems like this ginormous earthquake is made up of several earthquakes. Look at the ground shaking, strong shaking. We're looking at roughly about 150 seconds also. This is strong shaking, but overall, probably lasts 45 minutes. So in Japan, there's overall, we believe that they're pretty resilient. They have a very, very good system. There's some old buildings that didn't perform so well under very strong shaking, and also they have some landslide liquefaction. This building is certainly caused by a ground failure. More importantly, they have this enormous tsunami. Not only caused the tremendous damage to the communities and also damaged their nuclear power plant. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this thing. And also, this is the photo from a news media. Actually, it's a beer factory near the port of Sendai. Folks on standing on the roof. The tsunami was coming, I believe, at the time. Also, earthquake caused significant damage to lifelines. Lifeline is what we need to recover back to normal life. At this corner here, we have the Sendai airport was inundated by tsunami. Looking back to see how they behaved after tsunami event, I personally feel this airport is a successful story, although it was built near the ocean. The runway was supported by the very good structure down below, and well engineered. And a month later, actually the ginormous C-130 plane can land on this runway. It's pretty impressive to see that. And also we have the transmission lines damaged, and in many places we have a fuel problem. But overall, and I want to just quickly go over those statistics. Japan is very advanced and well prepared for earthquakes. As Chris mentioned, that the major problem they have is they underestimate earthquake magnitude and tsunami heights. As a result, they have 20,000 casualties due to the tsunami. They have a lot of hospitals damaged, some due to shaking, some due to tsunami inundation. They have a lot of school buildings also affected by the earthquake and tsunami. The total economic loss, people throw the number somewhere with 300 billion or 900 billion, even a trillion. To me, this is a big number. I have no appreciation of the magnitude of those numbers personally, because I don't have that much money. So then, the overall, and the earthquake generated 25 million tons of debris. Think about the problem we're going to have in our state, in Washington State. How do we deal with all the debris? And then because of the nuclear meltdown, and they're going to suffer long-term electricity shortage. although Japanese people is very resilient, I know that last summer, they automatically, voluntarily turn off the fans, try to conserve energy so that everybody can have a bit of electricity. So Jay went to Japan in May. I went to Japan in June, and we share the same feeling. When we took a speeder train from Tokyo to Sendai. As soon as we got off the train station, business is back to usual. I didn't see visible damage over there. And people, also kids are walking on the street, and restaurants are very busy. It's just they have their normal life. And until I hit the coastal region, where the tsunami inundated those communities, now I realized there was something happened 3 months ago. Otherwise, I didn't see any sign of damage from earthquake. So the one thing I want to talk about is the Jay's visit is at Tohoku University. The university is built on top of a sort of hill, if you will. He documented a lot of some of the localized damage here and there, but to me, the level of damage is not that extensive. Start off with the student center. This is a 2-story tall concrete building with a big cantilever. No sign of cracking. Very nice. There's a temporary modular building because the temporary construction, they didn't do a good job on the foundation preparation. So they have some localized landslide problem, caused some damage. That's about it. There's another building. From the structural engineering perspective, we see these discontinuous walls. We start to worry about it. But this building doesn't have any sign of damage. Probably these walls are non-structural walls. And then they went to the engineering building. And engineers like to use all these sophisticated devices. They have some dampers inside it, a shock absorber in the building. Building open with no damage. Walking through the building, you see all these dampers, and also they have a little explanation on the wall to tell you where the dampers are and what do they do for the building. Clearly, you can tell this damper did it really well, served the purpose. And there's a seismograph actually in the building, failed at point AG. What does that mean? This building went through very, very strong shaking, did well. There's one building, architectural science building. This building went through a couple of earthquakes and was damaged in previous earthquakes, and they repaired it. This time, they had an additional earthquake between the tower and the podium at the base. So you can see there at each side of the transverse walls, they added additional tension rods to restore the capacity of the wall. Building was red tagged. So when Jay was there and students were, after they repaired the building, students were allowed to go into the building to retrieve their contents. And the Japanese colleague was talking about how they repaired the building, etc. According to Jay, this building eventually will be torn down because I think they had enough of this building. But in my mind, this building is perfectly fine. They can reuse it if they want to. There's another building, applied chemistry building. This building is a concrete building, but it was retrofitted with steel brace frames, as you can tell. The building did really well. There's another building was red tagged. It's also a reinforced concrete building. In the front, you didn't see a whole lot of damage, but there was a red tag in front of the building. On the east end, we have walls. All of the walls go all the way to the top, and on each side of the window, and then in between the windows, above and below the floor level, we have these coupling beams. These beams, essentially, because they have these pipe holes to go through this area, so they have some damage. In the front of the building, in another frame of part of the building, they have some cracking going on in the columns. The crack size is reasonable, but overall, overall the building, I think you look at the overall entire campus, those are the two buildings red tagged. Another building is two-story building. It's a two-story concrete building. You see that they have this classical called a short column, because this column is confined by the masonry walls on each side. So this short column would tend to be very stiff and tend to absorb a lot of forces and typically form X-shaped cracks over there. This column was retrofitted previously with the carbon fiber. Building performed really well. So in this campus with 40+ buildings, we have two buildings, one repaired, the other one has cracks. Both buildings will be teared down. Think about the earthquake they went through, 9.0. Return period we're talking about over 1,000 years. I think that I would call this university is very resilient. So how they got from previous to now is they have taken very proactive action to retrofit existing buildings. And clearly with the resource in place, they can achieve resilience goals very well. Second piece I would like to share with you our observation with the tsunami. I was invited as part of the NS team with Clay Nato from Lehigh and Dan Cox from Oregon State, together with some of the Japanese professors. We went through several towns listed on the map. Essentially, we started from Sendai and Natori and go to Anagawa, Ishinomaki, Minami Sanriku, and Riku Sentakata. From this map, what you see here is this. From the Ishinomaki to south, generally we have this flat plain area. Beyond this peninsula, up to north, we have these so-called rear coast, essentially like a sawtooth shape with lots of valleys. And this topography is not something we have in Oregon. We tend to have more like this type of topography. So because of the special topography they have in Japan, they have a very, very high inundation depth. I will show you some of the photos. For the as part of this NS team, our purpose is to collect data on debris, and I will quickly go through some of the debris. The reason we want to do that is because we are doing some niche research at the Oregon State University. So we want to quantify the effects of these debris so that we can better prepare for our codes for our tsunami committee work. Start off with the wood debris. This is the top photo is from Riku Sentakata. They planted, I believe, 60,000 trees along the coast to protect the community, and only one tree survived. And all the trees end up in the buildings like this. This is a 7-story tall concrete building. It's a hotel building. Water just rushed in, and a lot of trees ended up in their lobby. This is the Minami Sanriku. That was me standing inside the hospital. I believe this is the second level, I believe. There's a giant enormous tree inside the fire room. Vehicles, you saw that on TV many times. Boats and ships, we have all sizes. And in Tsunami, we see a gigantic ocean cargoes were inland. In Natori, we saw these very small speedboats. And in some cases, these boats landed in different elevations. For example, this one is on the top of the second story. And also the shipping container debris. We went to the port of Sendai. We saw a lot of cargo containers deformed due to the impact colliding against each other. And some of the container actually run into their office buildings. And the other thing is also the tsunami generates tremendous amount of building component debris. And that's something we need to consider this seriously. This is in Onagawa. In Japan, they use a lot of concrete cladding material. As you can see, some of the cladding was stripped from the building. Now I hit all these elevated structure over there, steel structure. And this is in Minami Sanriku, the hospital. This is a hospital building. In front of this entrance of the hospital, we have a truck, a stair, and also the steel frame. So some of the damage from the impact, you see this is a steel column in Onagawa. You can see the deformed, clearly the column has absorbed a tremendous amount of energy. It's a good thing. And this is a Cascadia, a boat of some sort rammed into the structure. This one created a big hole. And this is all from the incoming wave. And also when the water leave the town, sometimes the debris also will hit the top structure, cause the top level collapse as well. So when we do the tsunami evacuation building design, we need to consider both, incoming wave as well as outgoing waves. So to summarize the performance of the construction, we have Japanese wood construction in many ways is similar to ours. And typically is if the inundation depths, if reaches 4 meters or higher, your house is gone. If it's the 1 meter is equivalent to roughly about 3 feet in that range. So the 2 and 2.5 feet is a good cutoff line. If the water is reached that level, you have a pretty good chance your building will be swept away. This is the one exceptional we saw in Tori. It's a temple. You can see this building is very open and allowed the debris to flow through, and this building survived. Steel building, steel material is a very resilient material, can absorb lots of energy. Generally, they perform relatively well, but also we do see some collapse cases. And this is one from the receding wave. This is potentially from the coming wave, and etc. But what you see here is this: steel structure is still standing, the skeleton is still standing, but all the contents are pretty much stripped away. For the reinforced concrete, by far they perform the best. Okay, and this is in Onagawa. Essentially, there's a pedestrian bridge. This is spanning from this building to that building. These buildings performed fine, and the pedestrian is gone. There's some impact we see from there was an adjacent building ramming into this building, but overall building is fine. In a couple of cases, if the building is conceived somehow and there's a hydrodynamic loads when the wave comes in, create this type of localized damage. So the general impression is concrete building performed really, really well. This is the one we saw, the hotel we saw in Riku Takata. That's the hotel building. The water rushing this way to the lobby, and there's a wall on the backside of the lobby, so water cannot go, so they have to go sideways and push the wall and deform like this. I was pretty impressed with the power of the water actually to cause this kind of level of damage. And also the other thing is even though the structure performed really well, this is a building in Minami Sanriku. The structure performed really well. We can see that we still have crap on some of the balconies. But what you see here is the foundation. It caused a tremendous amount of scouring. And you see the piles, they are already exposed. Yeah, so these are the things we need to consider when we design the tsunami evacuation structure. So we need to use the really solid grids to tie all these pile caps together so that we can, even though we lose some of the soil support over here, we still can rely on the slab to transfer the load back to the interior portion of the piles. Japan also, they have a very systematic approach to deal with the debris. And this is in the Tori, that's what we saw. They were breaking the concrete chunks and then strap the steel out, and then further break these concrete chunks into small pieces for reconstruction. Very, very nice. After done with building, let's talk about storage containers. And in Ishinomaki, Onagawa, we saw lots of oil containers, very large size. They were drifted to many places, and sometimes they are broken, and all the content just simply went out and caused some probably environmental concerns. Typically these are fuel tanks. Fuel is lighter than water. Even your tank is full of fuel, if the water is deep enough, still can pick you up. And oftentimes, these tanks is maybe half full, so it's very easy to pick them up. And if you want to anchor them down, we did some calculation. It is really, really difficult. you have to put like really, really close spaced anchor bolts to keep them down. It's very difficult. So this is one of the problems we have to consider in the engineering community. How do we deal with this? We did some survey in Onagawa. So the original, I believe the original tank is, this is a Google map. We were able to find out these footprints of these tanks. And then we trace them where they are. This tank went here, and there's we have some tanks went all the way to there, and there's another tank traveled almost 1,100 meters all the way to here. And here we have some tanks at high elevation, 10 meters above the sea level, and and they have the containment walls. Although the tank was sort of drifted away, but the retaining wall stopped at one of the tanks. But that's something from here. We learn that we feel that probably would be a good idea to elevate your tanks at high elevation to avoid a tsunami. If you cannot do that, you have to think about other ways to address this problem. Port facilities. Previous I talked about port is the ocean, the shoreline dropped by roughly about 3 feet. This is the Port of Sendai. I talked to the engineer in Port of Sendai. I said, tell me what happened during the tsunami. They said we did not evacuate before the tsunami came in. And then when we saw the tsunami coming in, a lot of workers, they simply jumped into their cars, and they ended up in the bay. They were killed. I'll show you later on. There is actually an evacuation structure at the end of the bay. They did not use it. So then, when the water come in, these container essentially, like a lethal weapon, just cram these cars and hit them real hard. So it's an issue. So how do we deal with the worker safety in port like this if we have a tsunami hazard? That's something we need to think about. So this is a Japanese engineer tell us where the inundation depth is, roughly about 10 feet or so. And when the tsunami wave comes in, and the water essentially destroyed all these motors, so electrical panels. When we got there in June, they are still in a slow process replacing some of the motors. Okay. This is Professor Dan Cox. For those of you who know Dan, he's a big, tall guy. This is the top of the quay wall, and that's where he was standing. When the water leaves the town, leave the port, we have a liquefaction problem, of course, and they have a scouring problem, and essentially causes this huge hole actually behind the quay wall. We talked to a Japanese engineer. I said, what's your plan to restore your operation in this port? They said it's going to take 18 months for them to restore back. The reason is because the port, the shoreline dropped for a couple of feet. They have to build the port back up for a couple of feet in order to make the port line up with the ship. So that's how they needed 18 months to restore. That's something I never knew before. It was pretty interesting. So if we have Cascadia, subduction also will cause our ocean shoreline will drop for a couple of feet. If we have port on our coastal region, we have something. This is something we need to think about, how we're going to restore the service. Japan, it is well prepared for tsunami. And I was really impressed to see all these maps, the signs, and also annunciators. It's well prepared. It was very impressive. I haven't seen those sophisticated maps in our coast. I hope we can have some of these maps actually in our coast. We only have the tsunami. We only have this, but we don't have the distance to the tsunami evacuation site. We don't have that information. And I think probably would be good to have that. In Japan, they have lots of tsunami evacuation structure. This is Minami Center by the water. It's a 4-story tall concrete building. It's 4 or 5 story tall. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A 5-story tall concrete building. They have an elevator open to public. So folks, if you want to use to get to the roof very quickly, you can use the elevator. On top of this roof, actually, they have a steel cage. A steel cage essentially is if the water, in case exceeded the roof level, they can hold on the steel cage so that they won't be swept away. In this case, actually the water does exceed the roof level. Thanks to this steel cage, they saved a lot of people. Also, there's another type of structure we saw in Japan. Yeah, this is called earthworm type of structure. We could consider in Oregon. And so this is the Port of Sendai. That's the port we're talking about. At the end, we have this earthworm. I believe this is the beer factory or something like that. That's the Korean beer factory, I believe. So anyway, so if you go to there, there's a beautiful sign. You show the layout of the bay, and then this is the plan view of the structure. Essentially, it's like a pyramid structure. On the back side of it, there's a little baseball playground. The frontal piece is essentially they chopped a little bit so that when the water comes in, pushes up, will go to each side. Essentially, that's diverges the water, so that water can constantly come up. I think this is a very smart idea to do it. This earth berm and also has handicapped access from the back side of it. On the side, in the front side, we have the stairs. The structure, in my mind, is pretty cheap to build, and you can, through the beautiful urban planning, you can fit this into very nicely into the community. And in Onagawa, we saw a lot of overturned buildings. This is something I've never imagined. How can you overturn a building? No way. But we saw that in Onagawa. There's several buildings. One building is this is a steel building supported on the piles. The piles actually, if you zoom in, there is no tension capacity. And then there is another structure. It's like a freezer building, well concealed, and when it almost functions like a boat. When the wave come in, they pick it up like a boat and overturned. This building is on a mat foundation with no piles whatsoever, and was also overturned. And based on the direction of the building, probably this one toppled probably when the water receded. Probably this one, when the water come in, turned the building over. So when we deal with the building, if we want to design a tsunami and evacuation structure, we need to make sure we can firmly tie our building down to the foundation with piles. In Onagawa, I want to share with a few successful stories. In Onagawa, they have this hospital building in the high ground. The hospital roughly is about 50 feet above sea level. Although the building was still submerged at ground floor level, but I consider this is very successful because they have a clear consideration of having a hospital above the tsunami inundation depths. Standing in front of this waterfront looking back, that's where the hospital is. And going inside the hospital, that's where you see the water line. 3 months or 4 months later, the ground floor is not usable. Only one operator is operational. The other operator is still dead. Minami Sanriku. This is the one. This is the 4-story tall hospital. The hospital was, when we were there and we went into the building, I was standing on the 4th floor level. You can see the water came in, bent to the elevator door, and also a dead fish actually on the floor. What happened is this: when the tsunami happened, there are a lot of patients in the building. The folks below 3rd floor level, or on the 3rd floor or below, all of them were killed. Okay, we do not. Hospital is meant for operational, during and after earthquakes and tsunami. So that's something we need to consider. Where should we place our hospitals? To the north of Minami Sanriku, not far away from the waterfront, we saw another hospital was smashed. This is also in Minami Sanriku. They have a 3-story steel structure. That's their emergency operating center. When the tsunami happened, actually the mayor and their 27 responders were in this building. When the tsunami came in, they all went to the roof. On the background, that's the hospital we're talking about. This hospital. Later on, the water reached the high level, and those guys were to climb to this communication tower. 21 out of 28 were swept away. So where should we place our emergency operations center in our coastal community? Schools. This school is located in Ishinomaki. This is a sad story. After earthquake, the students and teachers, they went to the playground, get ready for evacuation. The teacher came back to each room, make sure there are no students left behind. And then they line up, trying to go to high ground. In the middle of doing that, the tsunami wave came in, and 74 students were killed out of 108, and 10 teachers out of 13 also were killed. If we may not have enough evacuation time, in our coast, we have roughly about 20 to 30 minutes evacuation time. If we don't have that time, we need to think about other means to evacuate our students. This is Cannon Beach. This is the seaside. Seaside, I want to point out, there's a school over there near the river near this river here. Okay, when the wave comes in, the water will funnel towards the school. Think about that. And if we want to evacuate, how do you evacuate? You have this water line here, little creek or river cut off. They have to go through the bridges. What if bridges collapsed? What are you going to do? And also, in Japan, they designated a lot of tsunami evacuation sites and buildings. After the earthquake, tsunami, they documented more than 100 tsunami evacuation sites were swept away or inundated. Totally ineffective. So a lot of people thought that they went to the safe side. They were not. So these are something we need to consider when we build tsunami evacuation structure in Oregon. We want to make sure that when we deal with the tsunami evacuation structure, we need to be tall enough so that we can protect the people. Last lesson I learned was, I think one of the main lessons I want to share with you is people don't evacuate in Japan in some cases. Previously, when I worked on the Cannon Beach building, I thought that as an engineer, all we need to solve the beautiful structure over there, people can use it. But I never thought about it. People don't use it. What are you going to do? The story is from Kamaishi. In 2010, Chile earthquake. It sends a tsunami wave all the way to Japan. And what they found out is a lot of Japanese people, they simply don't evacuate for several reasons. One, people thought they were safe, in a safe zone. Another reason, people didn't even aware of tsunami coming. So there was one university. What they did was they went to schools, elementary schools and middle schools over there in Kamaishi, tried to teach students. The principle they teach includes do not trust evacuation map. Do not trust what the teacher tells you to do. Go to the high ground as high as possible. Don't wait for your parents. Don't wait for your mom and dad to pick you up. Basically, those are messages they share with the students. Hopefully, these students can go home and share this message with their parents, teach it to those adults. And so after the earthquake, and their group of middle school students in the playground, because they lost power, so the communication system wasn't working. So, but a group of students thought about what they learned from the college students in their school. They started to evacuate on the map to the evacuation site. The teachers on the second level, third floor level, saw the students are moving. They also lead other students to follow these students, a couple of students. Along the way, when they passed the an elementary school teachers saw the students going to the evacuation, so they also took all the students with them. Along the way, they also pick up a few adults. They reached the first evacuation site. One student said, well, this doesn't look safe because there's a sign of landsliding. We need to go to less high ground, 700 meters away, which they did. As soon as they got there, they looked back. Their school was swallowed up by a tsunami wave. And later on, their first evacuation site also was swallowed up by the tsunami wave. So the takeaway for me from Japan experience is that building all these physical infrastructure is important, but you have to teach people use it. And frankly, we should teach our students, don't trust the science in terms of tsunami prediction, all that stuff. With all due respect to our professors and researchers, we should probably teach the student that way. So takeaway recommendation is that tsunami seismic mitigation can help universities in Oregon achieve their resilience goals, and we need to assess our tsunami hazard very, very carefully. Do not underestimate tsunami heights. I really like Chris' approach, looking back for 10,000 years or beyond, so that we have a good confidence about our tsunami hazard assessment. And we need to have a sound planning. Put your school buildings, hospitals, critical facility in the right place. And the other thing is also we need to educate our people. We'll educate them and practice them with them so that when the difficult comes, they know what to do. That concludes my talk.
Thank you, Kent. Our next speaker will be Dr. Althea Rizzo.
No, that's okay. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to come to and talk to you about what we have learned about Tohoku. We're at 4:30 right now. We have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, so I'm going to kind of go through these slides. But I really there's some points here that I'm going to be driving home pretty hard. So I want you to remember what your mama taught you about assumptions and what happens when you assume something. So keep that in your mind as I go through this talk. When it comes to planning for a Cascadia level event, we really need to know our hazard. Dr. Goldfinger and Dr. Yu have made a very good case about how the way the Japanese thought about their hazard was a severe underestimation, and this led to a lot of the casualties that we saw here. So the planning assumptions that the Japanese had were very inadequate for the mitigation that they did subsequent to that. So their probable led to a response planning based on the recurrence of a smaller earthquake. Chris has already gone over this. The possible is what we have to start planning for. This is the significantly larger. The Jogan earthquake was considered an outlier. It wasn't considered when they were doing their response and mitigation planning. And so they just weren't prepared for the size. Now, they lost approximately 22,000 people. 92% of that was by drowning. So they did very well in the earthquake. It was the tsunami that was the killer. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But what I want you to take away here is there's about 6 million people, give or take, that live within 200 miles of the rupture zone. So they did very well in the earthquake, but it was really the tsunami that was the killer. And one of the reasons why was because the initial earthquake estimates put it at about a 7.9, and that fed into their assumptions. And so when they got those initial indications of how big the earthquake was, that fed into what they were expecting. So they stopped seeking information. In some cases, they had to because they had no power and they had no telecommunications. So the first tsunami warnings that the Japanese meteorological group put out were for a smaller sized tsunami. And then the power went out, they lost telecommunications, and they weren't able to get the subsequent warnings of a much larger earthquake. And that's one of the reasons why some of the people did not evacuate. They were told that the tsunami was going to be much, much smaller. They didn't get the subsequent information that the tsunami was going to be much larger because they had lost power, lost telecommunications. So some of the factors that affected survival during the tsunami, geography and topography, just basically the lay of the land. Did they have high ground to get to? How far away was that high ground? through their pre-disaster land use planning, they built vertical evacuation structures, they built seawalls. Chris talked about the one small village that has the seawall that they can close that performed very well. So there were some things that helped and hindered their survival capability during the tsunami. But the largest factor really was the human element. The time of the event was actually fortuitous. It was in the middle of the day. If this had happened in the middle of the night when people were asleep, we would have seen a much larger death rate. So we were very lucky there. The downside was the largest preponderance of people who died were the elder. Because they have limited mobility, they couldn't get themselves out. They couldn't hear the warnings. So the elder population really took the largest brunt of the casualties here. Some other factors that led to casualties here was caregiving behaviors. Family members went back to get the elder people that were in their homes and subsequently lost their lives. Another reason that people didn't evacuate was they drew inaccurate conclusions based on past tsunami experiences. Past tsunamis weren't as big as this, so I survived that one, I can survive this one, it's no problem. And then people also have an instinct to protect property. They went back and got pictures, their photo albums, whatever it was that they went back to get and lost their lives because they went back into the danger zone. Some of the survival factors that really worked was the areas that regularly practiced drills did very well. They knew what to do, they didn't hesitate, they evacuated when they were supposed to do. Kent talked about the school kids that sort of gathered up people as they were evacuating. That was actually one of the best ways of people finding out that they should be evacuating was they saw a lot of people running. And so if you see a lot of people running, you might get the clue that you might need to be running yourself. So that worked very well. The message that we want to hear is that we really need to practice, we really need to drill, and we really need to educate. So some of the recommendations that I have is that we really need to enhance our evacuation routes where high ground is available. We put up blue signs. We put up a few blue signs saying tsunami route, we call it good, and we hope that our visitors are going to be able to find this at 2 o'clock in the morning in unfamiliar territory during stormy weather. Remember, tomorrow is the anniversary of the last Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. Try getting up in the middle of the night in an unfamiliar town and trying to find your way to high ground in an area you're not familiar with. So we need to harden the infrastructure. We need to make sure that there won't be any landslides covering the evacuation routes, that the bridges out of the area are secure. We need to do a much better job of clear wayfinding, making sure that we have line of sight with our signs. Once we get to one sign, we can see the next sign. Maybe have lighting. Maybe have a lot of lines in the ground, and we need to practice, practice, practice. And where high ground is not available, we need to build that vertical evacuation structures. We really need to embed the tsunami information in our ambient built environment. When you go to the coast, you need to know just instinctively almost where high ground is, how to get to high ground, if you're in a safe zone, if you're in a bad zone. This one image here is, whoop, that moved it forward. We have the column here that marked the high ground. So we need things like that in our built environment. We have signs here that mark how far it is to safe zone. We have brickwork. That's all the way up to the safe zone. So we need to build this into our ambient environment so it's, you don't even have to think about it. You just follow the yellow brick road. One of the benefits is for Cascadia planning is we know that we get these big earthquakes. And it's not just possible, but it is probable here. We have 3 metropolitan cities in the impact zone: Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, BC. We're friendly. We share with our Canadian neighbors. We have heavy urbanization along the I-5 corridor. So we have approximately 9 million people in the impact zone, about 12 million if we include Vancouver, British Columbia. So that's a lot of people that are going to be impacted by this event. Some of the assumptions are you ain't going to be able to get there from here. It's going to take a very long time to get our transportation system back up and running. And if you remember, we are now a just-in-time society, and we have about 3 to 4 days worth of food on our grocery store shelves. Having these bridges open quickly is going to be a huge issue. Some of the Japanese emergency response challenges was the scale of the tsunami disaster. A lot of that damage caused a lot of problems because the early reports, remember, we're talking about a much smaller earthquake. And so over time, they knew it was a much larger one, but they weren't able to get that information out there. There was a lot of response issues because of the widespread damage. And the responders were victims themselves. And so when I go out and do my public education, I make sure that I teach my responders that they have to be prepared themselves. They can't be worried about their family, or they won't be able to do their job. He talked about the Minamasi San Rico, but other towns lost their entire political staff, lost their entire emergency manager staff. So, Linda, you're going to be it for that area. In the San Rico incident, the 25-year-old woman who lost her life was broadcasting evacuation warnings right up until the moment that that wave hit the building. She's since been nominated for a national award because of that. So the recommendation here is to ensure critical continuity. You need to relocate those facilities out of the inundation zone. This is not rocket science, people. We need to retrofit critical facilities, and we need to prohibit building new critical facilities in the inundation zone. And we need to make sure that even if they're not in the tsunami inundation zone, if they're being built inland, that they're meeting the most robust seismic standards. I'm going to kind of skip through the sheltering and get right to the recommendation. In Japan, there was a huge issue with sheltering because we simply couldn't get supplies out there. And it's going to be the very same thing with the Pacific Northwest. They have a much more robust infrastructure than we do. And so they were able to get up and running a lot faster than what we're going to be capable to be doing. So, you know, we tell the coastal communities they could be on their own for 6 weeks. So we need to make sure to bring the message home that it really starts with personal preparedness. The families have a month's worth of food and water in their home, especially if they're out in a rural area. It costs a lot of money to recover from these. He had talked about hundreds of billions of dollars just in damages. So these are very expensive. Now, it's pretty cheap now to go get loans because our interest rates are low. So maybe it's some time that we start investing in our infrastructure right now when our interest rates are low and really capitalize on that. But it takes a long time to recover from these. It takes 10 years. It takes decades. And if you don't do this ahead of time, it's certainly going to be a lot more difficult. Some of these communities are not going to recover if we don't give them the ability to recover ahead of time. So the recommendation here is we need comprehensive resiliency planning. We need to be thinking long term, starting this 50-year plan, just making sure that we got that plan set up. The thing to remember is the Japanese have been thinking about and dealing with earthquakes for hundreds of years. You know, they've shook out all of their weak buildings. We haven't had a big earthquake in the Pacific Northwest to start weeding out our bad building stock. When this thing happens, we're going to weed out a lot of bad building stock. So what we need to do is be proactive and go in and seismically retrofit all of those structures. We need to make sure that our land use planning isn't putting critical facilities in harm's way. We need to make sure that we have a robust lifeline infrastructure. There's one pipeline from Tacoma to Portland that carries our liquid fuel. It crosses the Columbia River into highly liquefiable soils at the Port of Portland in very old facilities. So we really need to rethink how we build our infrastructure. and we really need to strengthen our schools. Our kids go to school every single day in buildings that are subject to collapse. Our children are the heart of our culture. We need to make sure that they're protected, and we need to do this consistently over time. So I want to make sure that you know that you can't prevent an earthquake, but you certainly can prepare one. And since we've been talking about some really scary stuff, I have a picture of a kitten to make you feel better. So we're going to segue into the questions. I think we have about 10 minutes.
We have almost 20 minutes.
We have, oh, perfect. I was a lot faster than I thought. So we got 20 minutes, but once we're done, we do need to move out because they have a class coming in at 5:30. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all the speakers. Start to take some questions from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for Dr. Goldfinger. I was very struck with the video of your conference because I heard from presumed experts here that we're not going to be able to move once the rolling starts. And is this wrong information, or
Well,
are the buildings so different?
Your mileage may vary. I mean, we were about this. We were at a similar distance, to the main shock rupture plane as actually a little bit closer in that movie than we are right here. But I don't know anything about the site. I don't know how much amplification it would have. So I can't really compare that to anything directly. I mean, the G-force that we felt, there was a seismometer in the building that we were at, and the G was about 0.2 G, which if you're not an engineer doesn't mean that much. But the peak was much higher than that. It was more like 1.8 G. So we were not anywhere near the peak acceleration, and it shook much harder at other sites. But I think that's going to be fairly comparable to a mid-Willamette Valley type of site. But had that building been an unreinforced masonry building, even that relatively modest shaking for 5 minutes would have brought it down, I'm pretty sure. But it's not going to knock you off your feet, even at this range. At the coast, it might. But in Japan, most people at the coast even were able to stand up and get around. They weren't immobilized by the shaking itself.
And I'd like to point out, Dr. Goldfinger, you were very fortunate to be in a base-isolated building. I heard in another presentation that there's somewhere around 2,000 base-isolated commercial buildings in Japan. It's a true testament to the value they place on seismic strength of their buildings.
That's right, exactly right.
Next question. Yes, ma'am.
In the Northridge earthquake, we learned about the efficacy of seismic gas shutoff valves. And the previous Japanese earthquake, there were a lot of fires. Were there many seismic shutoff valves, or what feedback do you have from that issue?
That's something actually I personally did not pay attention to. Probably if there were some issue, probably rectify that already. Japan's pretty good at that. And I think the fire, they did have a big fire, and the fire was due to the tsunami. That's not necessarily from the shaking. And that mostly happened in Cascadia. I do want to point out that I don't want to have a direct comparison between Oregon, Washington to Japan. We have I don't think we have have same level of system and a level of preparedness. One of the things is the fire after earthquake. We have well, if you look at the urban planning perspective, yes, we have a very high dense population, a lot of old homes packed together, similar to Japan. But I have to say our water system, it's much more vulnerable than Japanese water system. And they use the pipe-to-pipe connections. They use seismic connections. They can absorb lots of movement. Our connection is very brittle. And if we count on a fire sprinkler to put out fire, I think that would be very difficult. And the other thing is also after fire, we're relying on the telecommunication system for people to call 911. And if even a fire station, at the time is functional, And we want to make sure the the routes is clear and bridges are fine, so that people, the fighters can be driven on these roads. In Japan, I think I personally feel our bridges are not big. So I think we're potentially going to have much broad fire hazard than in Japan. That's something we have to pay attention to.
Okay, but before I go to the next question, I'd like to remind anyone that's attending online to email your questions to the address on the screen. Yes, sir.
What's the political feasibility of any of these measures, say, if you're eventually being implemented?
That's a very good question.
And can I just add to that question, just to,
Yeah.
what, in addressing that, what needs to be overcome, I guess, one thing cost-wise, but...
Yeah, this is a difficult time to be telling taxpayers that this is going to be a very long-term, very expensive process. What needs to be done is the public themselves, our culture, our society needs to make the decision that this is important. Nothing will be done until the public thinks this is important. So that means you. That means you contacting your legislatures. This means you writing letters to the editor. This means you talking to your children, to your parents, to your grandchildren, that this is important. Because until the public says it's important, then it will not be important.
I'll just second that. And I'm just a geologist. I'm not a politician. But people call me up all the time and just say, "What should we do? Is my school safe?" A woman named Amanda Gersh called me one time and said, "Gosh, my kids live in a school that was built in 1903. Do you think that's going to be safe?" And I said, "No."
Yeah.
And she found out, well, the school principal had told her that it was, and it turned out that was incorrect. And I said, really, if you want to do something, you can't turn to the school board or the school district or even anybody lower than the governor. I said, you should start writing letters and go from the governor on upward, and don't worry about the intermediate folks. And so she started doing that. And she has a petition going with 1,000 people on it so far. So it really, leaders will follow people if people make it happen.
I also want to add a quick comment. Our resilience planning is not about asking you to do overdoing seismic retrofit. We're just asking you to do as little as possible so that our society as a whole is resilient. Means we can quickly recover from a disaster. When we look at the recovery, we're talking about preserve the community workforce. And talking about community workforce is in order for you to go back to work. I don't care whether you work for Intel, whether you work for the city. You would like to send your kids to school. You want to go to the retail center, buy your grocery. You want to go to Safeway to buy your medicine. These are the basics you need to have. So if you cannot go to work because your kid's school has collapsed, there's a huge business impact, economic impact for our society. So I think the resilience plan we are trying to do over the next 50 years, is we trying to create a big dialogue, not just a bunch of engineers, a bunch of professors. We want to bring in policymakers, we want business people, owners, and utility providers. It's going to build a broad base. Let's have a conversation. What's important for our society? Right now, what we're doing is riding a motorcycle with no protection whatsoever. We don't want to turn ourselves into an Iron Man with steel plates from head to the toe. What we want you to do is nothing but, is it wise to buy a helmet for you to put it on? That's what we're asking for. That's what a resilience plan is all about.
And I'd like to point out 50 years is a long time frame, right? Building stocks will turn over in time, so it's just about setting the bar and setting the best practices as we renew our infrastructure and our built environment.
My guess, though, is we don't have that long, actually.
We may not have 50 years. So, yeah, good point. We would want to prioritize, item like schools or critical facilities. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. Thank you for coming here today, but I think you're preaching to the choir. I recognize your faces. But I do wonder what it will take to make us operational after an event. And I wonder from your experience in Japan, specifically you said you went back 3 months later than a colleague who visited in May or the beginning of
You know, the point I want to make is, you know, that the society is resilient, you know, and granted, Japan has, you know, it's well prepared. They have, you know, 10,000, you know, how many years? In your paper you said 1,000 years of preparation for earthquake. And they have lots of earthquakes. They flush out all these bad buildings, bad bridges. What's left are good ones. If you walk around Portland downtown, you'll see a lot of crappy buildings. And there are problems. So, yeah, so what, you know, it's different. So we have to come together, talk about those issues. And, you know, if we want, as Dr. Rizzo mentioned that, if we start building structure properly, correctly, I tell you this, we engineers know how to design building properly, we know how to build a building properly, but the thing is this, we need to get it right first time. We need to have you know, special inspection, make sure that the contract follows through all the construction details and all of that, and we need to get our performance goal correct. And once we have that, you know, over the next 50 years, every year we replace 2% of our inventory. By the end of the 50th year, we have 100% ready. So I think it's totally achievable.
There's there was a meeting in this room about a year ago, and someone asked a similar sort of question, and it turns out that there's some very simple common sense things that can be done. So somebody asked that very question: how do we recover from this? And the discussion went around to people, and it turns out the city of Portland stores their heavy equipment under one of the bridges. So it's gone. And a few years ago, we had a similar conversation in front of the state legislature, and they went around the panel, and one the National Guard commandant was there, and a Coast Guardsman was there, and the National Guard guy said, well, all our helicopters are in Afghanistan, so we're not going to be any use. The Coast Guard guy said, our helicopters are in World War II hangars, so they're going to get smushed, and we're going to be victims just like you. So as you go down the line, you find out some very simple things that knock out some very critical things that are not that hard to change. Build a better hangar for the Coast Guard, take the heavy equipment and put it in someplace better in the city of Portland. So there's some common sense things that are not that expensive that can be done.
Before I take one more question from the audience, we do have a question from online, from Jim Mahoney in Bend. His question is, a lot of the high ground along our coastline is sand dunes, sometimes forested, sometimes not. In the event of the earthquake, will these dunes still be high ground?
My guess is most of the dunes are stabilized these days by invasive species, so they probably will still be. It's another issue. So they'll probably still be dunes, and they'll still be high ground.
Yeah, Newport is working on a wonderful project called Project Safe Haven. We totally stole your title, by the way. On doing just that very thing. They are building on a sand dune just to the south side of the Yaquina Bay Bridge, because in South Bay area of Newport, there is no other high ground to get to. So that is a sand dune. They had a geotech study look at it. There will be some scouring, but it will be standing at the end of the day. And they are going to be developing that to hold between 1,000 and 3,000 people. So that's a wonderful project using a sand dune that will be there at the end of the day.
Thank you. I'd like to take one more question from online. This question is from Bert, who's in Vancouver, BC. And this question is, can North Americans develop a culture of safety without a long history of catastrophe?
Yes, of course we can. Will we? That's a good question. It kind of goes back to the gentleman over here's question, is we as a culture have to decide this is important. And we really have to realize, somebody has said that, we're kind of the first generation to know about this risk. What we need to do is start teaching our children and passing on this information. Remember what they did with dolphin-safe tuna? Imagine turning our children loose on a problem like this. So, yes, we can create a culture that is resilient and takes this into consideration and is prepared. It will take time. Do we have that time? I can't tell you. But we certainly have the ability. We have to make the choice. And it's as simple as that. It's a choice.
I would agree. Can we do it? Yes. Do we know how? Yes. Will we do it? Unclear. But I'd like to take the optimistic view that we can learn from history, and we won't. It doesn't have to take 1,000 years to figure this out.
Okay, thank you. I see 2 more questions in the audience. I have 1 more question online, and I think we'll have to draw it there so we can get out of this room in time. Yes, sir.
Dr. Goldfinger, you said that you don't think we have that much time, referring to 50 years. Could you just spin that out just a little bit more?
Well, well, the probabilities just from the paleoseismology say that we have a 37% chance in 50 years, and then that 50 years from now we will have used up or have exceeded 85% of all the known recurrence times in the last 10,000 years. So that's an actuarial number. It's the sort of number that you'd use to tell how many teenagers will hit trees, while they're teenage drivers, that kind of thing. Actual performance rather than a predictive proxy. So it's just a matter of numbers. There's no way to say within that range whether we'll have it tomorrow or even 500 years from now. But just based on past performance alone, that's the probability.
That could be less than.
Okay,
Right.
I have a similar question online, and then, ma'am, I'll come to you. This question is from Dave Mason, who's emailing from Victoria. Given the specter of a big giant like, I'm sorry, this is for you, Dr. Goldfinger. Given the specter of a big giant like T11 and T16 being the next Cascadia event, and based on the underestimation that happened in Japan, what water inundation heights should a town like Seaside, Oregon use for tsunami planning? And maybe the corollary would be, are we planning for the right event?
Hi, Dave. Dave works for the Canadian Navy, and he's wondering what's going to happen to their ships. Well, so we have a pretty good relative idea of those 41 earthquakes, what their relative sizes were. We only have a magnitude attached to one of them, and that's the most recent one. But we can compare it to the rest and say that the most recent one was not the largest. It was average, really, and that we have a handful, maybe half a dozen that were larger, and the 2 giants, T11 and T16. So in Oregon, we've done sort of probabilistic mapping using those values, and so we've planned for the giant event. It's a low probability event, but it's in the current planning. And so at least the state of Oregon's in the position of knowing what the run-up is at Seaside and Cannon Beach. Cannon Beach was where the study was done for T11 and T16. So that same thing needs to be done for the entire coast. It's also been done now for Bandon. So we have 2 sites where it's been calculated explicitly, and we just need to extend those calculations up and down the coast. And for Canada, Kellen Wang was involved in that same study, and it could easily be done. It's just a matter of doing it. So we have more than enough information now to plan for the worst case. And given that it's been 5,000 years since the last giant, I'd say that would be a good idea.
Thank you, and I think that ties to Althea's comment that we need to think about and plan for the possible rather than the probable. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I just have a question about any kind of educational programs that might work, really letting people know what a serious issue this is so that they can start thinking about it and take it seriously. I've been actively involved in this for a little over a year now, and in speaking with family, friends, 75% of my neighbors know what to take it seriously.
Absolutely. On October 18th in 2012, we're going to be having the Great Oregon Shakeout, which is a statewide drop, cover, and hold drill. So I would love to talk to people about coming to your schools or churches or wherever to talk about earthquakes and tsunamis. From March 8th to the 26th, I'm doing the Tsunami Roadshow. I'll be starting in Clatsop County and ending in Curry County, doing educational events up and down the coast with our National Weather Service partners and partners from OSU and whoever else I can rope into coming and talking about tsunamis. So contact me. I would love to get you guys more information. And really, it's you guys. People don't change behavior unless they see behavior changing in others. So you need to model the behavior you want. You need to walk the talk. So when your neighbors see you carting in all those bottles of water, they'll start thinking seriously about carting in their own bottles of water. You know something? How we act. Yeah, that's a decision we all need to make. Who we want to be, what we want to do.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, those little changes are starting to happen, and it's exactly right. Be the change that you want to see. And so local businesses are starting to do this. The Red Cross and Mercy Corps, just a block down the street. Mercy Corps realized they'd be pretty much put out of action. Their global headquarters is in Portland. And not only would they be in trouble, but all their global operations would be in trouble if they didn't have some plan in place to keep operating. So they've started doing it for themselves, not waiting for some government agency or somebody to do it for them. They're doing it for themselves. And the Red Cross noticed that, and they're starting to do the same. And so it's starting to get around, and the more people talk about it, the more people will realize that, you know, converting this looming sort of undefined disaster from a very bad disaster to just a very bad day is really potentially not that hard. It's doable.
One idea is, we can work with the Department of Education and build the earthquake tsunami education into their daily curriculum. Kids can go home, teach their parents. If parents, they don't know what's going on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for coming out and participating this afternoon. Please join me in thanking our speakers once again. If you have not done so already, please grab a handout about CREW. You can visit our website at www.crew.org. And if our speakers still have time, they'll be out in the lobby to continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.